Welcome everybody to this seminar of our public first evening seminar series. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the director of the Institute of Criminology, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the two speakers and then to coordinate the discussion. Before I introduce the speakers, just briefly, how we're going to run this. Let me just see whether I can make this work. This was the list of seminars that we have had so far. We're now at seminar 4. The entire seminar series for this term is organized around innovations in criminal justice policies. And the idea of this seminar series from the beginning was to address topics that have been mentioned and are discussed in the agenda of the new government. And so we thought engaging with this agenda would be important. And of course, topics around migration, you will all know, are one of the key challenges that this government is thinking about, and so we would know about this particular policy issue. So the important thing here is, here is the model that I would like to adopt for questions. I would like to encourage everybody to use Slido to post your questions. That will allow us to afterwards have a more organized conversation where I will pass on questions, I will synthesize questions and put them to the two speakers. Of course, we will then also allow you to intervene and respond. And if you rather want to ask a question in person, that's also okay. But this has been, we've tried this now several times, and it has been working very nicely, and it helps us to bring together questions and make sure that all the questions, or most of the questions, are answered. So with that, I would like to introduce the speakers.
Manuel.
Yes.
Sorry, on the previous slide, there are 2 different Slido codes.
It's the new one, which is, this one is wrong, sorry. And the Slido 3763242 is the correct one. Hello. So please use this one, 3763242, or the QR code. We have 2 speakers today, which I would just briefly like to introduce. The first speaker, our first speaker, is Dr. Peter William Walsh, who is senior researcher at the Migration Observatory and departmental lecturer in migration studies at the University of Oxford. It so happens, by the way, that our 2 speakers have 2 inverse migration histories, in that Peter has his PhD from the University of Cambridge, where he studied sociology and modern society and global transformations, and then went from Cambridge to Oxford, while Paolo has been postdoctoral researcher at Nuffield College in Oxford and came from Oxford to Cambridge. So this is kind of like, it's an interesting example of migration patterns of a particular kind. Peter is the observatory's spokesman on several areas related to migration, and he's also quite active in kind of like public communication around issues relating to migration. He has written extensively both reports and papers on relating to UK migration policy, families, student migration, and so on. And so it's a great pleasure for us to have you here. Paolo, I don't know whether I need to introduce him. I see that many MPhil students are here, which is fantastic. He's professor in criminology and complex networks. He was, as I already said, research fellow at Nuffield College and the Department of Sociology at the University of Oxford. And he's doing research on criminal networks, but he's also been doing particular research on the migration, on human smuggling and human migration, and the role of organized networks to facilitate human migration across countries, across continents. And so it's a great pleasure to have these two speakers here who have been working or are working on related topics. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction and for the invitation to speak to you today. It is absolutely fantastic to be back at the Institute. It's been a long time. I was last here in 2009 when I took a paper called Criminology, Sentencing and the Penal System. Is that still a paper that the Institute provides? I received the most wonderful lectures from Professor Nikki Padfield and also from Dr. Michael Rice, who also was the most wonderful supervisor. And he supervised me for 3 years and was probably the most important intellectual influence that I had from the 10 years that I spent doing all of my degrees here at Cambridge. So I thought today I'd provide a broad overview of the new Labour government's migration policy, both legal and then turning to illegal migration. Now, first of all, overall numbers. Labour has said it wants to get net migration down. Now, in the British context, net migration was at the very heart of debates on immigration to the UK from 2010, when it was introduced as a Conservative policy, when the Conservative government were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And the aim then was to reduce net migration, which is immigration minus emigration, typically in the period of a year. Immigration and emigration defined as people moving for a period of at least 1 year. The aim was to get net migration down from the hundreds of thousands, as it was then. It was typically between 200 and 300,000, to the tens of thousands, i.e. below 100,000. Now that aim, the government never came to within 100,000 of that target. It always remained with, I think, the exception of 1 year, above 200,000 per year. And then that target was silently, well, not silently, quietly dropped in 2019 under Boris Johnson's government. The Migration Observatory, where I work, we've been arguing for a long time that it was really a fanciful target, that you'd have to substantially restrict student migration, work migration, family migration, the asylum system, refugee resettlement, to come anywhere close to hitting that target. But Labour have said they want to get net migration down. We can see here from this chart that net migration increased really rather substantially after the pandemic. So you can see in 2020, a low point there, given restrictions on travel, but it has shot up since then, reaching 764,000 in 2022. Really striking, especially because a key reason that people voted for Brexit, for the UK to leave the EU, was to get control of the border and get immigration down. And we can see here in the post-Brexit period, net migration is running at between 2-3 times greater than it did before we departed from the EU. So Labour wants to get net migration down. And actually, I have some good news for the Labour government, which is that net migration can, barring any unanticipated shocks, all other things being equal, the usual caveats, we are expecting net migration to come down in the coming years. And this is for 3 reasons. The first is emigration of students. So if you see the teal line here, This shows student migration of non-EU nationals to the UK. And you can see this increase from late 2020 up into late 2023 in study migration. Notable increases post-Brexit, post-pandemic, perhaps due to pent-up demand. And you would expect most of these students to depart when they graduate. That's a fairly natural mechanism for net migration. You can get this big increase in student migration, but the large majority, typically between 80 and 90% of students, do go back home. So in this period, we're expecting student net migration to decline as the big number of students that came in the post-pandemic period depart. The second is declining immigration from Ukraine and Hong Kong. So you may recall that in early 2021, after certain restrictions were placed on Hong Kong by the CCP, the UK created what it called a bespoke humanitarian route for Hong Kong nationals, in theory open to over 5 million of them. It actually wasn't so much like an asylum route or a refugee resettlement route. It really functioned actually just like a normal visa, albeit a more liberal one. So if you paid for the visa, and it did cost money, and you paid for the immigration health surcharge, several £1,000s per individual, you could come to the UK if you're eligible, if you were a Hong Kong British national overseas citizen, and be able to work in any job, study, and enjoy all the rights of people with permanent residence in the UK. 150,000 Hong Kongers came in the first 2 years of its operation, so that drove up net migration, and those numbers now from Hong Kong have slowed down substantially. The Ukraine schemes, very large numbers came under the two main humanitarian routes for Ukrainians, that's Homes for Ukraine and the Ukraine Family Scheme for people with Ukrainian family members in the UK, that's settled residence or citizenship. You can see that weekly arrivals were very substantial, peaking at 10,000 in May 2022. Then they fell to below 1,000 a week in early 2023, and now they're in the low hundreds per week. And that is expected to continue. A total of 250,000 Ukrainians arrived under the two main routes. The third reason is that earlier this year, the Conservative government introduced a number of restrictions of the immigration system, and Labour is not planning to repeal these restrictions. So what are these? Earlier this year in March, the Conservative government banned care workers from bringing their so-called dependents. So these are a partner and any children. Labour is retaining that ban. This has been a very popular route over the last couple of years. It was actually introduced as a carve-out or an exception to our high-skilled immigration system, which is based around people coming in if they have A-level or equivalent education to do jobs at that level, or graduate level jobs, but not jobs that are deemed to be low skilled. Care, we know how difficult care work is, but it is deemed to be low skilled. An exception was made for that, and for the first couple of years of its operation, these individuals were permitted to bring their close family members. That was restricted earlier this year. Labour have given no indication that they intend to repeal that. Labour has also said it's retaining a ban on student dependents. This was introduced by the Conservative government in 2024, and that applies to people doing 1-year master's courses, which are very popular with international students. There was already a ban on undergraduate foreign students bringing their family. That was extended to 1-year master's students, 2-year research master's students, and PhD students still permitted to bring their partner and any children. And that particular restriction already appears to have had some effect. Student dependent visas are down 80% in the first half of the year, a fall of about 50,000 visas. Labour is not undoing that restriction. Well, that's student visas. What about skilled work visas, our main work visa? The Conservative government increased the minimum salary required for a skilled worker visa. They increased it substantially from around £26,000 to £38,700. So if you want to get a job in the UK and it's not in health and social care, and it's not a seasonal worker, fruit picking, that's the other exemption, you'd have to earn a salary of at least £38,700, although there was an exemption for care workers and senior care workers. Now, Labour has given some mixed messages on what they think about this. For the time being, they're committed to asking the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the independent body in the UK that advises the government on migration policy, to review the impact of raising the skilled worker visa salary threshold. The second part of Labour's work migration policy is to try to reduce demand for foreign workers by improving the training of people already resident in the UK. Under Labour's proposals, employers in sectors that are reliant on foreign workers, they would be required to draw up skills improvement plans to train UK-based workers. Now, the Home Office, in the first month of office, commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to actually look and carry out research at two sectors which have high rates of foreign employees, namely IT professionals and engineers. The Home Office is very keen now in understanding why these sectors are so reliant on international recruitment. So that's work migration. Now, family migration. The Conservative government also increased the family minimum income requirement. That's the salary that a British citizen or a permanent resident in the UK needs to earn to sponsor their foreign partner and children to join them in the UK. Before April this year, that was £18,600, and that was increased to £29,000, so more than £10,000 increase. But that was only the first of three proposed rises in the Conservative government. They said they would raise the threshold until it reaches £38,700, which would be prohibitive for, we believe, around 60 to 70% of potential British citizens and settled residents who would wish to sponsor their family members to join them here. Now, Labour has said it has real concerns about this increase in the minimum income requirement, and again has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to review the change. So, in brief, yeah, there aren't any, there haven't been any new ones yet. But thank you. So Labour is not planning to reverse restrictions on student or care worker dependents, but is reviewing salary threshold increases both for skilled work visas and family visas, and wants to improve the training of UK-based workers. This is a different kind of approach to that of the Conservatives, which focused on restricting supply, and they proposed to restrict the number of work visas issued by a simple numerical cap. Labour's approach is different. It's trying to reduce demand. Now, the potential impacts of training UK-based workers are fairly uncertain. I mean, training has merits in its own right, but it will not necessarily reduce work migration. And this is for the simple reason that the level of jobs in the labour market, the number of vacancies, is not fixed. So, for example, if you train more engineers, you get more engineers, and then UK employers may simply decide to employ more engineers. And this is a phenomenon we see not only in the UK, but in many developed countries worldwide. And of course, more training won't address the elephant in the room, which is high vacancy rates in the care sector, where the underlying driver of shortages there are low pay and poor working conditions caused by limited government funding, which makes it difficult for care providers to retain workers. So to actually address labour shortages there would require substantial government investment, and neither the Conservatives nor Labour like to talk about that and discuss that reality. So for the time being, it seems that we will continue to rely on foreign workers in the care sector. So that's legal migration. What about illegal migration, asylum, and enforcement? Well, the Labour government has made two pretty major changes already, and these are in relation to policies that aim to reduce the number of people crossing the English Channel from France in small boats. Just a few notable statistics here. 46,000 people reached the UK that way in 2022. That was the largest number on record. Statistics began being counted in earnest in 2018 when just 300 people arrived over the Christmas period then. So the numbers really have increased very substantially. It's thought that a part of the rise of the small boat route may have been the UK government's investment in restricting what was previously the most common irregular route to the UK, which was stowing away in lorries, lorries that would travel by Eurostar or on big boats on ferries. We understand that form of entry continues, but certainly the sense that existed while that route was common, that the channel was really a very big obstacle, that it wasn't a viable route, has become gradually eroded as more people have successfully made the trip over the past few years. But the kind of investment the government made in restricting lorries was very, very substantial, with kilometres of additional fencing, the freight terminals at Calais, and CO2 detectors, heartbeat monitors, canine patrols, really very substantial. Solved one, or addressed one problem. But as we know, the networks behind irregular migration can be quite adaptive. Most people who arrive in the UK by small boat, they claim asylum on arrival. That makes sense, because if you don't claim asylum, then you're in the country without authorization and liable to be detained and be removed. Nevertheless, of those who have received a decision on their asylum claim after arriving in a small boat, almost 80% received positive decisions, i.e. the government said, yes, we do believe you are a genuine refugee. This is quite striking because government ministers have previously suggested that the majority of these individuals were economic migrants. Perhaps that does apply to certain nationalities like Albanians, who have a very low success rate in their asylum claims. But for the 80% that are successful, it's perhaps not all that surprising when we take into account where they come from. They come from some of the most chaotic parts of the world. Afghanistan was, for the last 2-year period, the most common nationality after the rise of the Taliban and the fall of Kabul. Citizens from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, Yemen, Sudan, these are places racked with civil or ethnic conflict of various kinds that suffer under political repression. So that helps us to understand why the success rate might be so high. So Labour, the first thing it did is it gutted the Illegal Migration Act, which was the Conservative government's most recent and most important piece of primary legislation to address small boat arrivals. Under the Act, the government would not process people's asylum claims if they arrived in the UK without authorisation. Now, the Labour government has axed that part of the Illegal Migration Act and has returned to processing claims as they were before that Act came into force. Now, it was because of the Illegal Migration Act, the previous government effectively stopped processing the asylum claims of those people who arrived after the 7th of March last year, a backlog of about 100,000 people. Now, Labour undid that by statutory instrument in July, and so they've begun to process asylum claims as they were before the Illegal Migration Act became law. The Labour government has suggested it may formally repeal the Illegal Migration Act in its entirety. There's still some aspects of it that are in force, expanded detention powers and powers of removal, that it will do so via primary legislation, and it will have parliamentary time to do so with the upcoming Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill. Now, the second big policy change is, of course, the axing of the Rwanda scheme, under which the previous government planned to deport to Rwanda unauthorised entrants to the UK, regardless of whether they wished to claim asylum, regardless of whether they were genuine refugees, regardless of whether they had been trafficked. Now, that scheme was later broadened to include the removal of unsuccessful asylum seekers. And that policy was really designed on the principle of the one-way ticket. So it wasn't offshore processing of the kind that Australia has used, that Italy is pursuing with Albania, where people would move to that third country while their claim is being processed, but that claim would be processed under the rules of the country they arrived in, and if successful, would be given the right to return to that country. Rwanda's scheme was very different. People would be sent to Rwanda, they would have their claims processed within Rwanda's asylum system, and if successful, would be given status in Rwanda, not the UK. So that has been axed. I mean, I would suggest that the reasons that the Labour government has gutted the IMA, axed Rwanda, is not necessarily out of a liberal instinct to protect migrants' rights. It may very well be hard-nosed practical and operational reasons. What Keir Starmer and the Home Secretary say again and again is that it wouldn't work. They did not believe that Rwanda would work. My own view is that it would have fundamentally depended on how many people were sent to Rwanda, and there were always real questions about capacity. The best estimate suggested that maybe we would send a few hundred to Rwanda each year, but with irregular migration in the tens of thousands each year, that would suggest a pretty slim chance of being sent to Rwanda, raising questions, of course, about how that actually might affect the calculus of people thinking of getting in small boats. If it's sufficiently low, then perhaps it might not make much difference at all. And bearing in mind these are already people willing to take a quite substantial risk in getting in a small boat. There's been already 60 deaths this year, for example, the most deadly year on record. So the Labour didn't think Rwanda would be effective. And we know that they're very keen to reduce the costs of the asylum system, which have skyrocketed in recent years and now over £4 billion a year. That's in part because of the very substantial asylum backlog that the previous government generated, from about 10,000 people when they came into office to 180,000 people a couple of years ago. These people typically are housed in accommodation that's paid for and provided by the government. It's private rental accommodation that's organised by the government and will be in receipt of asylum support payments. So this explains why the asylum bill has increased so substantially. £700 million was spent on the Rwanda policy, and no one was forcibly removed. A few did go voluntarily under assisted voluntary return scheme and were given about £3,000 to do so. So Rwanda's gone, and the Labour government is redirecting money that was earmarked for Rwanda to a new border security command that they say is going to be staffed by specialist investigators with counter-terror powers. Now, at first glance, this looked to me quite similar to what the previous government had pursued in this area, which already had a small boats operational command. It was staffed by specialist ex-military personnel, just like the Border Security Command. The one thing it didn't have was counter-terror powers. Although I think we need to really see the detail on how those powers are going to work. We understand it will be enhanced powers of arrest, of seizure. There were questions raised the other day on the radio by a previous border security official in the UK, who said, well, some of the real challenges with this is that the people you wish to prosecute are not necessarily, not only within UK jurisdiction, but within the broader jurisdiction of the European Union. You know, the head figures in the smuggling networks often working abroad in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, and so on. So I think there are questions that can be raised about the general enforcement-led approach of the Labour government. It's very much of a piece with that pursued by the previous government. And I think that approach could hardly be described as a success, even though smugglers are arrested, they're prosecuted, even though many people are prevented from departing from French shores, with still tens of thousands slipping through the net. Hard to describe that policy as a success. Now, recently the Labour government released a press release putting some meat on the bone of their enforcement-led approach, which has four main parts. The first is a new specialist intelligence officers brought into the National Crime Agency, and a 50% increase in officers sent to Europol, the idea being that this is fundamentally an international issue. and greater cooperation will be necessary to tackle it. Now, at the moment, there is a real lack of evidence on the impact that a specific policy change like this is likely to have. But thinking logically, more resources invested into tracking down smugglers, prosecuting offenders, does mean more will be brought to justice. But there's a separate question of how exactly this may affect the market for smuggling. That is unclear. You could imagine that the smugglers, if they face increased risk, that could drive up the price that they would charge for passage in a small boat. There's a question about how elastic that market is. We understand migrants now pay anyway near from 2,000 to 3,000 euros. A few years ago, that was as high as 4,000 to 5,000 euros. So the overall impact of that particular kind of measure very unclear. And smashing the gangs encounters real practical difficulties. The French really take great pains to point to the 300 kilometres of viable coastline from which these boats can depart. They point to the senior figures in the smuggling operations working overseas, and they highlight that the people most directly involved in the smuggling operations, those tasked with getting the boats to water and getting people into the boats, they're quite agile. They work in small groups of between 5 and 10 individuals. You smash one, you apprehend one, and another group pops up in its place. So that's the first part of the enforcement-led approach. The second is closer to home. It's to do with people who are already in the UK regularly rather than new entrants. And it's a new intelligence-driven program to target employers of illegal workers. New, better intelligence, that's really the key. What kind of intelligence? Because previously much intelligence in this field was fairly low grade and consisted in ordinary members of the public calling up a helpline and saying, oh, well, yes, we've had our eyes on that corner shop or that Indian takeaway. You've got some dodgy people going in and out. And so often when immigration enforcement turn up at premises like that, the hit rate was embarrassingly low. You know, often they turn up, they process maybe 20 people, and they wouldn't apprehend a single individual. They were all there with the legal documents to do so. So there's questions about what will be the nature of the intelligence, and that is really important. The third thing is an increase in immigration detention. So the Labour government is initially going to create 300 new spaces across 2 new sites. They describe them as new. Actually, they're old sites that are being reopened. Campsfield in Oxford and Haslar in Portsmouth, that was closed after a report described it as expensive and damaging to detainees. Similar issues at Campsfield House in Oxford as well. Now, there are currently 2,200 spaces in the UK's detention estate across these immigration removal centres. So an initial increase of 300 is an increase of 15%, although you can see here that Haslar and Campsfield House, the ultimate hope is to be able to get an additional 1,000 detention places across those 2 sites. However, the key is whether you can actually remove people. And this is something that the government has found increasingly difficult in recent years. Now, 10 years ago, 60% of individuals who left immigration detention in the UK were left to be removed, to be returned to their country of habitual residence. But that's fallen to between 20 to around 40% in recent years. So this shows total returns. It's broken down by the different categories of return: enforced, facilitated or monitored, where the Home Office plays a part and often gives money to aid in the individual's reintegration back home, and independent, where individuals leave of their own accord without informing the Home Office. The mauve colour here is just to indicate that those figures are somewhat provisional, because you actually find out after the fact that people have actually left. But you can see the numbers are well down on what they were in the early 2010s. So that is going to be a real challenge. Some of the challenges include, well, people are in the UK, they don't have documents, they claim to be from a certain country, the UK gets in touch with that country and finds it really difficult to prove that in fact this is a citizen of the country to which they wish to return them. So that brings us neatly to a new returns deal with Europe. Now, this is a high priority for Labour. We were at the part of such a returns deal to facilitate the transfer of asylum seekers between member states. That's when we were a part of the EU. It's called the Dublin system. After we left the EU, we were no longer a party to that, and so we couldn't return people generally to the first, say, safe EU country in which they arrived, countries like Italy, Greece, Spain. There is a question here about what this deal that Labour is trying to pursue will look like. It may prefer a bespoke deal with the European Union, but the EU tends to prefer, would probably prefer the UK to sign up to its existing asylum framework, the EU Pact on Asylum and Migration. How might that look? It would probably look actually fairly similar to the Dublin system, in which we could return some people to the EU, but would be expected to take some people in return, probably those with family connections in the UK. Finally, just a few words on offshore processing. So Labour recently, Keir Starmer recently visited Italy and professed to be interested in an offshoring policy that Italy is pursuing with Albania. I think there are real questions about how viable this is going to be for the UK. Offshore processing historically, not just in the UK, but elsewhere, has proved rather difficult to implement in practice. It comes with diplomatic, logistical, legal difficulties, not least that there's a real challenge in finding safe third countries that are willing to offer up their territory for offshore processing. The case of Australia is instructive. It offshored people to Papua New Guinea and Nauru in the early 2000s onwards, although there was a break in between there. The first thing to point out is that it was a tremendous financial cost. It was estimated that processing a single person in either of those countries cost about 4 million Australian dollars per year, but only a few thousand Australian dollars to house them in local communities on mainland Australia. There was also a quite high humanitarian cost, and human rights and refugee charities widely view Australia's offshore processing program as a thoroughgoing humanitarian disaster, facilities that were appalling conditions, rife with abuse, very poor mental health and physical health outcomes, which is actually why Australia didn't offshore a single person from 2015 to 2023, although I understand they've now begun sending people to Papua New Guinea and Nauru again. So the next few years, I think, are going to be really crucial for the UK's asylum and enforcement policy. But also, I think for the EU more broadly. I mentioned the case of Italy, and it's certainly the case that EU countries, they have a close eye on the UK. You have countries now like Germany and Austria who are seriously entertaining offshore processing. It would have been unthinkable for those countries to have put that on the table as they do now, even just a few years ago. So the tide is beginning to turn. The UK remains, I think, somewhat influential in this space. Spain has also cited the example of the UK's Rwanda policy, as has Germany. So it's going to be an interesting few years, and the Migration Observatory will be certainly keeping a close eye on things. If you want to read more about any of the subjects that I've covered today, do check out the Migration Observatory website. All of my publications, they go straight up onto that website. They're freely downloadable. They're about 2,000–3,000 words, and they cover pretty much every aspect of UK migration and policy. So thank you very much for your attention. And, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Peter, for this very informative talk. I really encourage all of you to go on the website of the Migration Observatory, because I use it as a trusted source of evidence on migration in broader topics on migration, including irregular migration, and I always found it incredibly helpful. So you're doing a great job at the Migration Observatory. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take on from where Peter ended, and I'm just going to zoom in into one of the issues. Peter has painted nicely this very broad picture and shows the complexity of the different moving parts that we have when we talk about migration. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to zoom in into one tiny slice of the migration topic. And I'm going to do it from one specific angle. So really zooming into one slice from one angle, which is irregular migration that is facilitated by those individuals that we call human smugglers. It is one angle, and it's the angle that I study because I study organized forms of crime, and every time we have individuals and groups coming together to provide and supply some sort of illegal goods or services. So this is the angle we're going to take, and following from what Peter was saying and what the Labour government has said they would do, well, we're going to ask the question. The Labour government said, well, the Conservative government said, we're going to stop the boats. The Labour government said, and I have the words here, so we went from stop the boats to smash the gang, which, as Peter said, behind the scenes, there's not a huge difference. And that's also what the CEO of the Refugee Councils wrote in The Guardian a few days ago. Now, but can we smash the gang? And what you smash the gang, first of all, is a political decision, and I'm not going to enter into political discussion, but let's say you want to smash the gangs. So in practice, what this will imply. So what does smashing the gang means in practice on the channel? Well, first, let's start with saying, who are the smugglers? And I remember one day I was interviewed by, well, unfortunately, after one of these terrible tragedies that happened in the channel, as they happen also elsewhere, well, I got interviewed, and I normally only get interviewed after some tragedies happen. That's where the media attention spikes for a couple of days and then it goes down. And I said, well, who are the smugglers? Well, I said, actually, the smugglers are the travel agency for the people who cannot go to the travel agency. And they cannot go to the travel agency for many reasons, but mostly because there is no legal route for the type of journey that they want to do. Which, to put it in a different way, and to use the language from the UN protocol against the smuggling of migrants, well, smuggling of migrants is the procurement of the illegal entry of a person in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit. But basically, you procure the illegal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident, which basically means facilitating the crossing of a border for which that person does not have the right to cross. Now, in reality, things are a little bit more complicated with the asylum seekers, and I get to this point at the end of the presentation. But this is human smuggling. So the human smugglers are the people that organize border crossings. And if we look at what Peter was mentioning, well, if you look at the border crossing, the channel in small boats, well, these are the numbers for the last 4 years. Well, you can see 2020 and then 2021, 2022, I put the numbers here, the totals, well, the highest was in 2022 and then went down in 2023, and now we are probably going to be a little bit higher than 2023. So that's the number until November the 3rd. To put things in perspective, there's been an increase in the small boat crossing, as they call them, but also there also been a shift in the way people cross the channel. As Peter was mentioned before, probably 10 years ago, there were way more undocumented crossing using lorries and using other means of transportation. Now, these means of transportation are still used, but since security at the borders has increased massively, there's been a shift into more dangerous way of crossing. And the two most dangerous way of crossings are refrigerated containers and small boats. Now, the other thing that happens with small boats is that we record and identify people more. So 10 years ago, if people got into a trailer and or into a truck, that person would have hardly been identified. Now, if people get on a boat, the entire set of people in the boat gets immediately identified. So numbers goes up. That's why comparing 2021 with 10 years ago, well, you have a massive increase. And this is explained by this, in my reason, by these two separate reasons. One is shift in the type of crossing, and the other one is more identification. Now, to put things in perspective, in 2023, I think 1.2 million people entered the UK on a visa legally. So we are talking about roughly 40,000 people out of a total of 1.2 million. Just to put things in perspective. You might not feel that way when you look at the media, but this is the scale. Now, of course, these are also risky crossings. The number of people who died at sea in the channel has increased this year compared to last year, and that's probably because smugglers feel the pressure and they tend to put more people on boats. That is probably correct. That's likely to be the case. But now to the question about stopping the boat or smashing against one of these slogans. Well, what does the business of human trafficking or human smuggling look like? And why is it so challenging to smash the gangs? Well, it is difficult for a number of reasons that are intrinsic to the business model. Now, the first reason, as Peter already mentioned, is that the business is incredibly fragmented. It is fragmented and is segmented. So you would have small groups operating and providing the smuggling services for a part of the journey, and you would have multiple small groups operating in the same area. So it's not that you go to Calais and there is only one smuggler that organizes the crossing. There are multiple smugglers that organize the crossing. And normally there is a person, a smuggler, a main smuggler with a few helpers. What the French police says, the estimate of smuggling groups being between 5 and 10 people, I think that's correct. That's absolutely correct. More on the 5 side than the 10 side, which basically means that you have a number of small-scale organizations, and there is no clear Mr. Big that runs the business, which basically means that it's unclear, there's no easy target from a law enforcement perspective. It's very different from what you might see in wholesale drug trafficking or with mafia-like organizations, where you do have certain specific targets. Second, individual smugglers can be easily replaced. So this is a business that does not require huge investments. So in a sense, it's easy to enter the market. It's easy to set up shop. It's easy to turn into a smuggler. And you can see that because you have many stories of former migrants who turn smugglers, which basically means that all you need, the assets that you need, is knowledge. Knowledge about the border and compass. That's the only skill you need. You don't need investment in skills, in skills that require long period of time to obtain. And also you need low capital requirements. So the most expensive part of the job is to buy the small boats, the inflatable boats. Apart from that, there are no major investments that needs to be made, which that means that if a smuggler is arrested, well, of course, that bit of operation will stop, but that individual smuggler does not provide something that other individuals can easily provide. So others can jump in. Of course, then, if you do it on a massive scale, well, then there is a limit to replacement, but we are far from that. So in a sense, the type of business makes it easy for the single individual smuggler to be replaced. Third point, this was on BBC a couple of days ago, probably a week or 10 days ago. And it's a very interesting BBC investigations where they go and track some smugglers. And then the interesting part of this story is that the boats that are used to cross the channel are actually in Germany. So the boats are no longer stored next to Calais or in the Boulogne area because there is police pressure. So the boats were, first they were in Belgium, and now they are in Germany. So they are 4 or 5 hours away. But if you read the story, you will see that the smuggler says, well, we look at the weather condition and then we decide when the weather conditions are good, we take the boat from Germany and we bring it to Calais. So that means that the boat is not in Calais, it only stays in Calais a few hours and then moves, which this changes completely the dynamics. For the smugglers, it's actually very simple things to do, but for the authorities, that makes life incredibly difficult because then you have multiple jurisdictions there. And then you have the need to set up joint operation. So in a sense, what the Labour government is saying is not new because there were two parts to the conservative approach. The first approach of the conservative government was, we do it all by ourselves, and if France doesn't cooperate, we send the army. That was Boris Johnson. The second part of the conservative approach, so Act 2 of the conservative approach, was we need more international cooperation. So what the Labour government is doing is a continuation of the Act 2 of the conservative approach that already had a strong on-the-ground cooperation between the French and the British authorities, as well as the Belgian authorities. They're stepping up that cooperation. And when you read how smuggling is organized, well, that does make sense. Fourth, smugglers adapt very quickly to new law enforcement tactics and new policies. We see that in the Mediterranean, when the search and rescue operation was launched after the 2013 Lampedusa shipwreck, which was a very noble and very good things to do. Well, that the launch of the large-scale search and rescue operation meant that the distance that the boat had to travel became much shorter. So the smugglers integrated that into their business model, and they changed the type of boats they were using. So they could use smaller boats, which also means that they are less expensive to buy. So they have to switch from fisherman boat, for which there is a more limited supply, to inflatable boats, for which there is much larger supply. And they did it, in response to changes in rescue operations. Does this mean that we should not rescue people? Absolutely not. Does this mean that smugglers adapt to context and circumstances? That's correct. We also see the change in operation in the Calais area, particularly in the way that boats are stored and also the way migrants are brought to the coast. So before, migrants would spend way more days and time close to the coast. Now migrants are kept in those called safe houses, basically houses or places far away from the coast, because there is more police and law enforcement pressure next to the coast, which basically means that the area that police needs to police becomes way larger. Law enforcement, is incredibly resource intensive, and law enforcement needs to be carried out continuously and around the clock. This is not sustainable in the long term, and in fact, I don't have the number, but I imagine that here we're talking about the French side. Well, the French assign extra police and gendarmerie officers. But then other things happen in France. So something might happen in Rennes, something might happen in Marseille, something might happen elsewhere. So then they have to reallocate this special unit, which basically means that the pressure might go down for a certain period of time. I put 130 kilometers of beaches, sand and dunes. Maybe it's much longer than that. It gives you a sense of the complexity of the operation on the ground, a sense that you might not get by reading the Daily Mail or some other medium. Number 6, there is a demand for smuggling services. Let's not forget. So smugglers are there because there is a demand. And there are people that for many reasons, they want to cross the border. And the reasons can be multiple. So depending on the nationality of the person and the story of the person, reasons can go from fleeing a war zone, from fleeing poverty, for looking for better life, better economic prospect, then all sorts of reasons. People with different life stories, the only thing they have in common that they sit in the same boat for this small crossing, but then their path will diverge, which also means that if we talk about and we think about alternatives, that means that there is not one alternative that fits all. There are certain legal alternatives that might fit and must be suitable for certain category, certain individuals, but not others. For some people, for some individuals, based on their life story and their personal circumstances, the best alternative would be to be able to gain asylum, or at least to gain a permit to travel before embarking into the dangerous part of the journey. For other people, the alternative might be getting a work permit direct. So there are different alternatives for different categories. And Syrians are, the Ukraine scheme was, the UK and the Hong Kong scheme, and the Afghanistan scheme, but that didn't really move many people, were interesting examples. And finally, let me conclude on a controversial note. The controversial note is that the way the asylum system is set up at the moment, and the way, so the way the asylum system is set up and the way the current legal immigration rules are set up, the two together, they create a very perverse structure of incentives. So what countries are saying to people, we give you asylum and protection, but only if you arrive on our soil. So, which basically means you need to arrive in order to claim. And if you claim, we will protect you. Now, you can see that this creates a major issue, the way the system is set up, because how can you cross that border in order then to depose the asylum request? Well, the only way you can do it is by, well, most of the time, the only way you can do it is by buying the service of a smuggler. And this approach is schizophrenic, because on the one hand, you put millions and millions of pounds into smuggling against, but on the other hand, there is no way you can claim asylum, almost, without literally setting foot on the British soil. But this also applies to other countries. It's not just Britain. And I think I can see why people don't want to open the asylum regulations, because the fear is that if we start touching that legislation, then protection will just evaporate. So you just open, there is a huge risk that the moment you change, then protections will evaporate. There will be a much stricter approach. At the same time, the asylum system was designed with a different world in mind, a world that had way less mobility, where moving was much more complicated. And in the case of the European countries, there was the Berlin Wall, and it was an asylum that was set up, for instance, to protect the person that would jump from East Germany to West Germany, or offering protection in case of people fleeing, for instance. The idea was, for instance, the Holocaust, so Nazi Germany. So it was it is a system that I think we can say that struggles to cope with this type of migration. And you can see it with the problem with the Dublin rules. You can see it with the multiple requests for asylum. And you can also see it with the number of people that are left in a limbo, where they don't have the right to work while they claim asylum. The asylum system is expensive to run. It takes very long time. All countries struggle. Britain, but other countries too. Some countries like Italy, 2 governments ago, just decided not to give refugee status, but to give an alternative status, which was much faster, just to unclog the system. The system is clogged in all countries, and that means that there is a problem. Now, how to fix it? For me, the best system is a system that gives the right to work to people in a shortest possible period of time, because that not only decreases the cost to the taxpayers, but also gives people the incentive and the possibility to work, to fulfill their aspirations, and to contribute to the host country. And but this, we are far from that situation. Well, I stop here. I took this slide to say how much of the fun I had at the work of the Migration Observatory. This is Peter. There is a source. And you can see that the asylum claims and the boats arrival, the truck, they actually count, they go hand in hand. I stop here and we can continue. There are many other things to say and we can continue the discussion. This is not an easy topic because it's a complex topic and also it's a topic that involves in the people, hard stories, hard life, but also macro level trends that we cannot ignore. Yes, thank you.
Succeed in achieving that goal.
Why don't you talk about achieving the goal of smashing the gangs, then I can talk about the effects on small boat migration.
Yes, it's this is one of these $1 million questions. The point is that there are so many moving parts, and some are under the direct control of the UK government, but others aren't. So, increasing international cooperation and having a closer cooperation with the neighboring countries is a good thing in many domains. Now, whether this will make a difference, I mean, there is personally, I don't think the French are able to put more people on the ground than they already do. There is limit, and also the French police is under strain for many reasons. They might be able to decrease the number of arrivals. It will never go down to zero. There was a mistake that I don't remember which British Prime Minister was that put a number and says we go to zero. Keir Starmer actually steered away from it and refused to put a number, politically wise, because it's also a reflection of what happens in other borders. So what happens in the southern European borders, what happens at the Italian borders, what happens at the Greek borders, is also a reflection of what happens elsewhere in the world. If there is a new war and if new things happen elsewhere, this will have inevitably an impact on the numbers there. So unfortunately, it's not the case that everything else being equal, as we would like to do in statistics. So it is very difficult to say.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly more achievable than stopping the boats. I mean, it might be somewhat uncharitable to interpret it literally as reducing boat arrivals to zero, when that's, I think the prospects of that are infinitesimally small. Yeah, they'll smash some gangs. They'll smash them and they'll replenish. And I don't see the prospects of putting a real material event in small boat arrivals being particularly good. There are some other approaches, but they run into other problems. So the refugee and migrant rights sector talk a lot about safe and legal routes. It very much depends on what kind of route one has in mind. There's only been one Ukrainian crossing the English Channel in a small boat, but they had a scheme that was sufficiently expansive, uncapped. By contrast, there have been thousands of Afghans because they weren't able to access our bespoke humanitarian route for Afghans. But to propose a scheme on the lines of the Ukraine schemes, but that were open to all nationalities, is just politically not viable. You know, the trend in the UK, as with most other major asylum seeker receiving countries in Europe, is to restrict the asylum system to want fewer people coming, not more, because these people have to be looked after. You know, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. There's all likelihood that certainly in the short and medium term, refugees will be a net fiscal cost to the government. They will take more out in accommodation and benefits and support than they will contribute. Not necessarily their fault, by the way. The UK government doesn't permit them to work in those circumstances. But that's the trend. There's another kind of proposal, which would be a beach returns deal with France, because you could take these individuals and either physically intercept them in the water. The French could do this and return them to France. The French say that's not operationally viable because there's likely to be resistance to interception by the people on the boat, which will imperil their lives. And I think there's probably some truth to that. So that's not viable. Alternatively, we could have a deal where, okay, we return people to France once they've arrived in the UK. The French have given absolutely no indication that they have any appetite for a policy like that. But the way it might work is if we return people swiftly to France, then that could potentially substantially put a dent in the demand if it's not a viable route. But then, of course, we'd have to take some of those individuals. We would have to. You can't say, well, we're going to return them to France and that's that. France will never agree to that. So you have to offer the French something. And you could have a system where, you know, we actually could take everyone who's then returned to France or take some share. And that would ultimately be a safe and orderly route, but it would mean taking more asylum seekers. And the UK has not and does not want to do that.
Lots of interesting questions coming in. And I wanted to, well, there's one that's got quite a few likes. It's also, unfortunately, quite a demanding question. I'll pass it, I'll give it to you. We have more concrete questions as well, but I think it's a really interesting question and it follows what you were just saying. It's a very simple question. Give us 3 examples of what policies you would include in your ideal immigration system.
So that's a very easy question for me to answer, because the Migration Observatory is politically impartial and our whole reputation is based on the idea that we don't issue policy recommendations. So I'm professionally obligated to dodge that question. I would add though, so I don't want to entirely dodge it. You know, even if I were to give policy recommendations, it's an incredibly difficult challenge to be met. So, you know, don't think that because I've given that answer that I have some kind of silver bullet for this, or silver bullets, because I'm not sure they exist. It's an incredibly difficult thing operationally, politically, diplomatically, and I suspect there's no simple set of solutions for this, and I expect a regular migration of this kind to continue long into the future, frankly.
I want to try.
Well, there is no simple solution. Ultimately, there is some of the solutions are political. I mean, it depends on which political sides we are on, and it's not for me to. I mean, again, as I have my own political views, but those are mine, and here I'm a researcher, so I'll try to understand how things work. Then the political decisions about what is the level of migration that we want to have, should be higher, should be lower, should stay the same. That's a political decision, and it's for the electorate to decide. It's for the politicians to decide, not for me as a criminologist. Although I do vote, I won't tell you how, but I do vote. So some of the solutions are political, but we can spell out some principles. I think I would say some principle would be that issuing working permits that match the needs of the economy is a good thing. Getting people into the country in a legal way as much as possible is a good thing. Give people the right to work from the beginning is a good thing. Protecting people that are facing wars